Well, thank you. Thank you for hosting us, Molson Coors. It's really great to be here and to get us all together to discuss this really important topic. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to start off, since we're here at the Brand Innovators Conference, is start with a kind of lightning round of a first question. What was the first brand that you remember that made an impact on you and why? And I'll start with you, Julia.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So the first brand that I remember from my childhood is actually the board game Candyland. And I have a distinct story around this one. So when I was little, I was 4 years old, my family was relocating across the country from California to Florida. And my parents were driving, myself and my little brother, and we stopped off at the Grand Canyon. But my parents, for some reason I had it in my head that we were going to Candyland. That's what I had heard when they said we were going to the Grand Canyon. So we got to the canyon, I was extremely disappointed, very distraught. But there was something about Candyland that just stood out to me as a kid. The bright colors, following the path, the instructions are very simple. So that's the very first brand that I remember.
It's a tough one to follow. I'm going to go a few years later in life. I was in business school, wanting to get into sports marketing. And I was really intrigued by what Under Armour at the time was doing in the space. If you think about how enormous a challenge that was to go head-to-head against Nike and really carve out a space and make a dent, I think that was something that really piqued my interest, and it's kept me kind of close to the category ever since.
Hi everyone, I'm Brigette. For me, I went to actually Saucony because I had started running in high school and had to find a shoe that fit, and for me it was something that actually worked after handing back a pair of shoes that totally destroyed my feet, and I just became a repeat customer almost for life. So I kind of went to Saucony.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Delbecchio. The first brand I remember was McDonald's. So it is truly an honor to now work for this organization. But the brand that made an impact on me, it's another sports brand, it's Nike. And specifically the campaign, the If You Let Me Play campaign, if anyone remembers that work. I was, at the time, preteen, I was an athlete, I was playing on an all-boys hockey team because there weren't enough girls to have a girls team. And I remember watching that spot and hanging that poster in my bedroom and feeling like, I want to do this. I want to work in brands, I want to work in marketing, because I saw myself in that ad, and everything that that ad espoused about the benefit, the intrinsic benefit of playing sport for women, for young girls, and the intrinsic benefit that it has throughout your life, truly shaped who I am as a marketer and as an athlete. So 1995, that conversation decades ahead of the cultural conversation we're still having today, so very profound.
True, full circle moment in many ways. No, thank you. Before we start our panel, I thought I would give a few stats. So in 1981, that was the first year that women made up 50% of college graduates. So fast forward 30 years to 2011, less than 16% of women made up the top jobs here in the US. Fast forward a decade later, how much improvement has been made to 2021? Less than 21% of women and females make up the top jobs here in the US. And we know that females are underrepresented in the top jobs, so we really want to use this panel to talk through how do we get women to not only opt in, but stay in and get to the top. And it's even, when you look at numbers globally, as Sheryl Sandberg says, men are still ruling the world. Globally, it's less than 6% of women who make up the top jobs. So this is really a pertinent conversation, so I'm really glad to have this distinguished panel of women to share their experiences. So the first question, Amanda, I'm going to ask you, what do you think is the most significant barrier to female leadership?
Yeah, so we were talking about this before the panel, and I think two things come to mind. The first is a lot of talking and not a lot of doing, and I think that's evident by the statistics. I think we have the best of intentions. I work at a company where the senior leadership team is completely male. We talk a lot about it now, and we've acknowledged that we have an issue. But then again, I'd say what I'm most hungry for, and I think all of us in the room are, is the action that drives the change. And would say behind that is a resistance to really embrace, I would say, and not necessarily in a negative way. The resistance, meaning it's not coming from a place of, it's not malice. I would say the resistance to do something different and try to listen to voices in new ways, to have representation, whether you have a senior leadership team with women or not, but to find ways to get those voices in the conversations and the decision making and so forth. I think we often say or might hear, well, this is the way we've done it and that won't work. And that's the first, I think, mentality that has to change. And certainly when you're talking about the statistics like you are, I think that's a big factor. The second thing I'll tack on is, I feel like at least in the last couple of years, the conversation has gotten a lot more positive amongst women. And I might have given the answer a couple years ago that there used to be this sort of sense that there's only so many of us allowed up at the top. And I think women supporting other women now, I think that's maybe as a result of the convergence of Me Too and just allyship in general, it feels so much more clicked into place than it ever has. And as a result of that, I think we are going to ultimately champion our way back up to, or not back up, but to the top, and really make those changes that we want to see.
Yeah, well said, thank you. Brigette, this next one is for you. As you consider advancing your career with sites on the C-level, what are the biggest challenges or obstacles that you need to overcome or be thinking about?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting build, right, of what's the structure and infrastructure, but assuming that there are opportunities, I'll start addressing the men in the room, because I'm married and I have 2 daughters, and my husband is one of the most engaged fathers there is, and I travel a lot, and I couldn't do what I do without him. So people will say, oh, who watches your kids when you go? I'm like, their father? So there is something about a lifestyle choice at home and how you support your partners, or you think about the lifestyle that you want, because where this is going, particularly with more and more multinational companies, is those C-suite jobs require international moves or relocations domestically. And that's a really big hurdle, not just for men, but like as a mother, I'm like, these are my roots and this is where I want my kids to go to school. We were joking before that it's like the first day of school and bus stops. So having that personal like choice, it's not about always career management, but life management, I think is a really internal, intrinsic one that we've just always assumed on the C-suite. When I look at the people who are at that level, men and women, they have moved around multiple times. I think the second piece is, in getting to that point, women typically, or at least I've experienced, that we do the job, we do it well, because that's what's expected of us and that's what we think it is, and we assume that's enough. And it is never enough. You need to celebrate and sell yourself. You need to celebrate and sell the work that you do, that those achievements actually aren't not a big deal. They are a big deal. They took a lot of thinking and a lot of strategic work. And I'm not saying to emphasize what you do or overbuild it, but to own the credit where it's due and to let others know what that work is. So it's not always walking around as an advertisement, but as marketing, we talk about brands, and you have a self-brand that you need to actually market in your company. So whether that's getting access to places or taking on other assignments and then helping to promote yourself with them. And then the last piece I'll say is networking. You have talked about who do you network with, and that's harder if there's a lot of men and golf or clubs or whatever the stereotypical will be, but make sure that you have a strong network, that it's not just your mentors. That was a nice term that somebody said to me. It's who are the sponsors? Who are the people sitting at the table who are actually talking about you and elevating you through the role? So a mentor is great. They help you one-on-one. But you want sponsors at the senior levels who are actively pulling for you when you're not there.
Yeah, really great feedback, Brigette. Thank you. Jen, have you had a significant sponsor or ally, just piggybacking on what Brigette said, in your career? And can you speak to that?
Yeah, of course. I've had good fortune of working for many great leaders, and we had not discussed this before, but I would say my husband is my greatest ally in my career. And again, differentiating between ally and sponsor, but we've had the same conversations. We've moved 4 times in the last 8 years, at times living in different cities so that we could keep our kids grounded in the school, and the other parent could go and pursue their career. And those are life choices that we've made together. And we've picked up the slack, we've covered, where we can, but from an ally perspective, I could not do what I do if it weren't for the support relationship that I have with my husband. And in terms of sponsors, I agree, you need to have someone, we will say an advocate, someone who's at the table, who knows you, who knows your capabilities, who knows your work, and is willing to go to bat for you. And oftentimes, women, exactly to Bridget's point, are not actively seeking out that advocacy, and I think that that's something we need to do. And it's, earlier in my career, I would say it was maybe an ego thing, like I don't need to promote myself, I don't need to ask, I don't need to ask for help. People will see my capabilities, people will see my work. You have to advocate for yourself and find those people who will advocate for you as well.
Great advice. Next question, Julia, for you. How do you know when it's time or a decision needs to be made to leave a role and do something different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people probably have this experience, but it's when you start to feel stagnant, when you're not growing, you're no longer learning, you're just sort of phoning it in, rinse and repeating the same types of projects. I'll say all the roles that I've had, I've worked in ad agencies, PR agencies, then I came in-house to United Airlines, being on the brand side, but every role that I've had, I've always tried to stay at least 2 or 3 years minimum, build the relationships, get to know the category or my client accounts. But I found myself at points in time where I'm like, wow, I've done this particular type of project now 10 times in a row. I'm ready for something new and I'm ready to move on. So I really think it's something very internal that you have to feel where you're like, I'm ready to take on a new assignment, whether it's staying within your own organization, making a lateral move, getting promoted, or going somewhere else.
Great, thank you. Amanda, how would you describe your leadership style and how you lead? And how would you say that is different to some of your counterparts?
Yeah, so I work on, kind of going back to, maybe there's a theme here, I work on an all-male director team for my business unit. And so just to kind of address maybe more of the elephant in the room, because I think that's more interesting than some of how I could talk about my leadership style. I think that what ends up happening as the only female in a senior leadership role is you, by default, pick up some responsibilities outside of your job description. And I think one of the most, remarkable and rewarding parts of my job is that I get to pick up those responsibilities outside of my job description. So what I more specifically mean by that is I've got a lot of young women on my team who will come to me for mentorship advice or for career pathing and ask questions or raise topics they may not feel comfortable asking their own manager of. And so I found that feels like when we're talking about leadership, particularly from a women's perspective, that is our obligation, I feel. Once you get and you crack into those roles, you have to give back and you have to pull the rest of the folks along with you and make sure, we've been having some meetings recently with just the women on my team and just hearing their, let's call it, opportunities and struggles, you start to realize where you have, as a leader, the opportunity to put a support system in place and make sure that's enforced and have those uncomfortable conversations with my male counterparts who, again, I feel like it's very benign, but I think it's not top of mind, how there's those little decisions we make that may not give women that advantage or the voice or the share of the room. So I would say from a leadership perspective, we're naturally kind of drawn to maybe more of a purpose where you have to be empathetic, you have to kind of be reading the room all the time, but I also feel like that shapes you as a leader, because isn't that kind of the point? Evolve, sort of move with the flow. And so as a female in an organization that's acknowledging we have some room to grow, I feel like that's the biggest way that I can make a difference.
Thank you. Jen, as a follow-on to that, what benefits have you received from your leadership experience?
I'm someone who, I love people, and it is so rewarding to work with a diverse group of people. And yes, it's diversity in gender, it's diversity in race, but in a global role that I'm in, I'm also working on a very international team. Half of my team are non-native English speakers, and I work on global projects, literally working with people around the world. You know, sometimes that means 6 a.m. calls, sometimes that means 10 p.m. calls, but all of this exposure to different cultures, different ways of working, different backgrounds, different experiences, different perspectives, different motivators, behaviors, beliefs, all of that makes me a better leader, and quite honestly, makes me a better person. And I hope and I trust that then I bring that back into the team and help to bring awareness to some of these differences to those people who may not have that firsthand experience, may not have that firsthand interaction.
Yeah, that's really good feedback, because it's growing as a leader, no matter who you are, and then sharing those experiences so that you empower your team. So leadership has changed a lot during the pandemic. I think we all can agree to that. So Brigette, how do you feel that your leadership has changed over the past two and a half years?
I've always, so you're sure, Brendan, always been kind of a people person, and I'm pretty transparent, so my personal life and my professional life, people will know about it, because I talk like traveling, I'd be on a bus somewhere at night going to dinner, and I'm like, wait, hold on, it's bedtime, I gotta go call and FaceTiming on the bus. But I would say from a leadership with the pandemic, it has to be a lot more holistic. We talk about mental health a lot, and being more proactive and being very deliberate of saying, I hope everyone's taking their summer vacation. I expect you to be taking time off, and just giving that explicit permission for that. We talk about, so I think a holistic piece of like as a person and as the professional, how do we be a lot more as leaders comfortable in that conversation, and also taking, usually like, well, their home life wasn't my problem, or their personal life wasn't my problem, it's their work. But it is all one, so that's a big piece. A lot more focused. You know, we hear about this a lot of do less is more, bigger, faster, better, you know, whatever it will be. But at the same time, that really means that I have to prioritize. And so I think I'm trying to be a lot clearer on what are the priorities, what do we say no to, which is incredibly difficult, particularly as women. You know, we love to say yes a lot, which stretches us way too thin. Do a few things and tell the team, like, this is, and the other piece is for me being really explicit with my team of like, this is what's going on in the company, this is what we're doing as a team, this is how it all fits together, so that it's a very sharp and transparent leadership style versus hemming and hawing and trying to play to everyone's emotions. It's like being that laser focused on what we need to do.
Julia, how would you say that your leadership has changed?
Yeah, I think at United Airlines in general, and definitely my team in particular, you know, we talk a lot about bringing your whole self to work now more than we did pre-pandemic. And you know, in terms of the one-on-one conversations I have with my immediate reports, with other people on our larger team and our larger department, I also just want to cater my communication style to people, and this is something I've definitely sort of picked up on more in the last few years of working from home, working remotely, working hybrid. But when people want to talk, do they prefer email? Do they prefer the one-on-one ad hoc chat? Do they like a scheduled time on their calendars weekly? And as a manager, people manager, I want to cater to their communication style and preference first, rather than the other way around. The other thing that I'll say too, I think now, compared to the pre-pandemic days, the before times, we as a team, me as a leader, we're just acknowledging what's happening in the world. I mean, there's daily mass shootings in this country. There's the war in Ukraine. We have monkeypox. We have COVID. And I distinctly remember within the last year doing a couple of just general wellness checks with some of my team members after the Uvalde shooting, after the Highland Park shooting, like checking in. We're all signing on in the morning after this incident's happened and saying, how are you doing? Like, do you need the day off? Do you need time away from work? Let us know the space that you need. So I think it's just been a really emotionally taxing couple of years for everybody. But we've all changed as people managers as a result.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. So, best advice you received when you were rising as a female leader. So, Jen, I'll have you kick us off with that.
Sure. So I received this advice about 10 years ago. I was working for Coca-Cola, living in Toronto, and I was really struggling, feeling like I'm working so hard and I'm like trying so hard and I'm grinding and I'm not getting the results I'm looking for. And I had a mentor say to me, try, rather than persistence, try resilience. And I hadn't thought about the difference between those two things. But to define persistence is to choose a course of action and continue on that course of action in spite of obstacles. To define resilience, it is to choose a course of action and absorb or adjust or modify when inevitably those obstacles come in your place. And this coach painted this kind of mental picture for me of, people think that the oak is the strongest tree, and it is, but during a storm, the oak will fall and the willow will remain. The willow moves with the wind. And so when I had that mental picture, when I had that feedback, I started to realize how much mental, emotional, physical energy I was putting towards a fruitless task, and started to then consciously think when I was on a path and I met an obstacle, am I still on the right path? Is this an obstacle that I can overcome, or do I need to change course? And at first it became a conscious decision when I met those obstacles. And again, over time, practicing resilience, it's about giving yourself a little bit of grace. It's about taking a little bit of time, kind of bringing your whole self to the problem or to the opportunity. And now that kind of resilience, or that practice of resilience rather than persistence, is a normal kind of trained behavior.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy and visual with the oak tree and the willow tree. So Julia, what's the best advice you got as a female?
Yes, I feel like I've gotten a lot of advice over the years from various mentors, sponsors, colleagues, and this isn't just limited to women or people who identify as female, but be your own advocate within your organization. So I think there's a lot to be said for internal public relations and internal PR. Don't hesitate to tell your immediate manager, your leadership, something you accomplished. Share a deck with them, share a recap, step up from those opportunities to present at a town hall meeting, at a department meeting. And I think that goes a long way with people, I always like to say, people getting to know you, knowing you by name, then liking you, and then ultimately trusting you and wanting to work with you. So I think being your own advocate and internal PR is what it's all about, and one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever been given.
Well, and that advice has stemmed its way through each one of your responses today, not only being your own advocate, but your brand that you represent, and then being a voice for yourself. So, Amanda, how have you been most successful in mentoring or helping rising young females?
Yeah, I think when I was kind of contemplating this question, I think it comes down to the obvious, which is listen first before you start your own sort of let me tell you about myself journey. And I think when you listen, you end up realizing the most important kind of quality you can bring to that relationship is, I believe, vulnerability. And so it's sharing the ups and the downs of whatever your career journey or your personal journey has been. And it's that learning for those young folks that they get to see that I've made some bad decisions. I've picked some bad career choices, but I figured it out. And that's life, right? And I think it's learning to adjust and sharing those adjustments that you're able to kind of impart, what I hope at least, was some sense of hope and sort of strategy for people who will ultimately be in the same position as you are as they make different decisions throughout their lives. So I think it's being a really empathetic listener, and then at the same time it's also being very vulnerable and willing to share sort of the warts and everything that comes along with the decisions that you've made.
Yeah, vulnerability is definitely a huge key. Yeah, Brigette, what would you say that you've been most successful in doing with mentoring upcoming female leaders?
Well, one is just to make yourself available, right? So let people know that you're absolutely willing, and then when they approach you, to try and be responsive as best you can. So that's just the baseline. But as you were talking, Amanda, I'm just thinking, I've been at my company now for a long time, and my career did not go nearly what I expected it to be or how I had, quote, planned it when I started. And we were talking about this back when we were talking about the panel, is that's okay. And I think one of the two pieces, not only let me tell you about myself, but also my journey isn't the only journey, and frankly it wasn't even the journey that I thought that was going to be mine. So therefore, you have to take all the judgment away, and give yourself an openness as you manage your career that what works for you early on also may not work later on, and that's okay to pivot, and it's okay to say, I no longer want that. this no longer brings me joy, it doesn't work for me financially, it doesn't, whatever it is. I think all these constructs of, right, like to your point of the persistence versus a resilience is life throws at you a lot of things. Your career is going to throw at you a lot of things, none of which that you would have necessarily asked for, and others that have been incredible gifts. So I think it's really important to have a level of flexibility, which when you're starting out seems like this is the track, and in every company, we all talk about this is your career path, and where do you want to be in 5 years or in 7 years? Well, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, the company I worked at didn't exist, and these jobs didn't exist. And so now having me project that is actually almost a joke. So it's like, well, what do I like to do, and what do I think I want to do, and where does it meet all the other elements of my life, which means that those dynamics can continually to evolve, and so give yourself permission that, it's not about checking every box along the way, it's about living a life today. So.
Yeah, and Meg, if I may, the question of, where do you want to be 5 years, 10 years, 7 years, whatever, I've tried to reframe that to people. It's what do you hope to have learned in 3 years? What do you hope to have learned in 5 years? Because it's taking it from the external and the physical and the manifesting something that you don't know exists and bringing it back into yourself and reflecting on what are my skills, what are my strengths, what are my opportunities, what are the things that I need to either lean into and improve or go and find in addition to complement what I have to prepare me for whatever that opportunity might be in 3, 5, 7, 10 years.
Right, that's great advice as well, because as Bridget said, that job might not exist today, but it will exist then, but what are you doing to prepare yourself for that? So that's excellent advice. Now if we go back, so we started the panel with what was the brand that resonated with you. So when you go back to your young self, before you were a leader, who inspired you or gave you that confidence that I should raise my hand and I should go for it? So I'm curious from your vantage point, who inspired you, Amanda?
I'm going to answer this indirectly. I had a separate conversation recently around allyship initiatives at Wilson, and I got some really great advice that kind of inspired me as I was thinking about the answer to this question, which is if you look at the task in front of you and you're trying to make big moves and sort of instigate a movement, you're going to be overwhelmed and fatigued before you even get out of the gate. And so it's the little choices that you make or that you have the opportunity to influence that'll drive the change that you're ultimately looking for. And I feel like when I was thinking about the answer to this question, it's very similar. I don't know that I could point to a key leader or inspiration in my life, but I can certainly point to colleagues and peers and friends who have inspired me in a room because of the way they delivered feedback or held their presence or overcame adversity or took on a challenge that seemed like, wow, how did they do that? And so I think it's that collective experience where, we talk about building our own brands. You're being really self-aware of who do I want to be and what parts of those behaviors do I want to emulate. And similarly, along the way, you have some great examples of what not to do. So I think it's taking it all in and really, I think, acknowledging that in some cases, those answers are right in front of you in your collective circle and they show up every day.
Yeah, Julia.
Yeah, similarly, I feel like there have been a lot of different colleagues, managers, department directors, people that I've worked with over the years who have sort of inspired leadership in me. Particularly my very first job, though, I was working in a nonprofit organization. I actually started my career in healthcare policy and legislative advocacy before I wound up in marketing. But I had an executive director and a manager at the time who saw this ability in me to be a communicator and a marketer and said, you're really good at this, you should pursue this more, maybe not so much the policy and lobbying side of things. And that really was foundational for me to say, okay, maybe I should head in a slightly different direction from here. So I really appreciated that feedback very early on in my career. Definitely one job led to the next after that. But yeah, I think it's those day-to-day leaders, though, that you encounter. It's not necessarily any one figure person.
Yeah, I'm curious, Julia, when you got those day-to-day, and Amanda, you as well, were they a combination? Because it was a culmination of people and events that happened. Was it females and males? Was it predominantly one or the other? Because I can speak from my experience. My biggest advocate who inspired me was, it was a male and it was a former boss, but there weren't any female bosses at that time that I was reporting to. But was such an advocate, and I got a lot from him.
I think mine was a combination of both. I can say that I picked up along the way some really great advice and mentorship from both sides of that equation.
Yeah, I would agree. Maybe a little bit more among female leaders, just the nature of working in some of the agencies that I've been in, working in nonprofits. But it's definitely run the gamut.
Thank you. So Brigette, I'm curious from your vantage point, what do you think really impacts, or what are some of the factors that really impact a female's ability to lead today and in the future?
I think one is you have to cast aside a little bit of what are the assumptions of what it means to be a female leader, to be honest. I think it's, we all look for the day where they say, oh, she's an athlete, she's a doctor, it's no longer like a female doctor, it's no longer, this, we can stop labeling, and this goes across a lot of diversity and equity issues, but then we hopefully one day can just start labeling and just say, this is their profession, and we move on. That said, I think, for us, it's something to think about of not internalizing every emotion, and this isn't about women being more emotional. I think there's just an inherent nurturing, caring. There is that distinct community piece. If anyone watched one of my favorite stand-up comedian thing was Defending the Caveman, and you really want to know the difference of men and women, go Google that and watch that show, because it is so primal on some of the things that we do that we're not even aware. And I think it's balancing that. They're not weaknesses, but we all have biases and we have certain strengths and we overuse them. And I think for women it's, how do I compartmentalize certain things better? How do I remind myself it's business and it's not personal? I care about you as a person, but it's not my burden to spend so much of my time worrying about the next piece. So you're a professional and you're an adult and you will figure that out, as well as I will help you as a leader. So I think there's elements there. I think it's what we talked about before with some of the challenges of going in. I will say, just to get to the prior question, because I think it's an interesting one, you take from every leader what I liked, what I didn't like, what you watched. I will say there was one individual who was a managing director when I was an associate in investment banking, so it's a very hierarchical place, even though they talk about meritocracy. He was the chairman of our region, extraordinarily senior. He treated everyone with the same level of respect. You knew the pecking order, there was no question, because it was written on everyone's desk. However, he really showed as a junior person what it looks like when you share your power. When you share your power and your information and knowledge base, everyone's grows. And it was like, it has stayed with me. The more I've gotten senior, some people think I need to control more, I need to have my, if I tell my team less, and this is different from like learning what to tell your team or not, but if I tell my team less, I'm the one in the know. It works against you. And I found, particularly in the pandemic and in bigger roles where I can't be everywhere, spreading that power base out, everyone flies higher. So that's been always a really powerful thing.
That's really great feedback, sharing your power, and it kind of leads into the next one. How to use your vulnerability to build your professional relationships and grow in your career. And I'll pose that right back.
Yeah, I mean, like, man, female, marketer, director, VP, at the first level you're a human. And I always say this too, we talk about consumers as if they're aliens. It's like there's a human being at the core of what you're trying to sell. Like, would you use this? Would you eat that way? Humanity is really core. And what was being said earlier, like, holy smokes, we are testing the limits of where we are in humanity on almost every level of today. And unfortunately, we're failing. I'm going to say that right now. So we got a lot of work to do to pick that up. But I think reminding ourselves and speaking that way for the first time, like, how are people doing? It's not every session has to be kumbaya, but it is acknowledging that, like, the people walking in these doors are human beings first. And so I share it. I share when I'm overwhelmed. And the irony is, I was doing a leadership thing, and I'm really into, like, authenticity. Like, what you see is what you get. But what I learned is authenticity just means also, like, you can show up in different ways that are still true to you. It's like a dress, right? You put on a business dress, you can put on a formal dress, you can put on athletic wear. They're just different outfits, but they're all still you. And that was a really big aha for me the past couple of years. And the irony was when I showed a little more vulnerability on some issues or just what I was struggling with, the feedback was like, wow, like it helps us so much more to help her, and that authentic self, I was like, that came out even more. And so it's just a really way of balancing the TMI with the team, but valuing that there is a person and there's an empathy going on. And again, it's not just sharing power, but think about every leader you've ever had. If they're always perfect and there's no room for like this plastic, you can't wait for them to fail. You just can't wait for them to make a mistake, and the tolerance is zero. Whereas if someone slips up, writes them up, they're like, oh, it's Brigette. Like, it's fine. She talks like this all the time. We'll translate it for you later. And it just, it gives a piece where I don't have to, it's one less thing I have to worry about of being perfect.
Excellent feedback. And then just for the panel, as we close this out, you've got a tremendous panel of women here that are sharing their experiences and some of their best advice and what they've gone through as they've worked their way up the ladder. But how do you practice self-care? And I'll just let anyone jump in for this one. How do you practice self-care? Because some of us are mothers, but we're all women, we all have demanding jobs, and how do you find time and practice that?
Inconsistently, I will admit, it's hard to carve out specific time for things you would traditionally maybe think of self-care. I try to, in the evenings before I go to bed, give myself some grace, particularly if it's been a hard day, challenging day, I feel like I've under-delivered, I've made a mistake, that I did the best I could do today. That was my best today. And kind of giving myself that grace, letting go a little bit. And one interesting thing that I really missed during the pandemic, but now that we're back into the office, the commute to and from the office, I try not to take calls, I don't listen to music. I try to use that time as the separation time between mom Jen, work Jen, and then work Jen and mom Jen again, because, as Brigette said, we bring our families with us to work and we bring our work with us back home, but as best as possible to try to create a little bit of separation, to try to have a semblance of that kind of balance as a form of self-care.
Thanks, Jen.
Exercise, like for me, it's an output. It's my me time, and that means even like where in the past we would go out like when there's conferences, late night networking. I'm like, nope, like I want to get up early because like before the meetings I want to work out. So I've made those choices too of what I no longer will do for my health.
I think it's having the self-awareness to recognize when you need it. And I think that's also when we talk about consistency, like I can do that every once in a while. So I'm not probably the poster child for this answer. But I think it's exercise, I think it's travel, it's being around the people that you love who fill you back up with the energy after you're depleted. So just recognizing the symptoms of, am I a little bit more stressed? Why is that? And let me find a way to force a way to step away.
For me personally, self-care is being in nature. Being outdoors. Nature is restorative. To go out on Lake Michigan by Lakeshore Trail and spend time there, to drive out to some of the forest preserve trails. I love going camping. So that for me is where I get sort of my relaxation and a lot of restoration.
Well, thank you all for sharing. Thank you for sharing your stories today. And I hope that all of you today at least walked away with one thing, that the stats of women in top jobs could be improved. And it may not be our generation that actually moves the needle all that much, but it's the next generation. It's who's working for us, who's looking up to us. And we hope that all of you as our allies and sponsors are aware we can get those numbers up. Thank you all.